I walked out on my date after her shocking confession, and I don't regret it. Her response to "how many?" had me desperately trying not to laugh in the middle of the restaurant. I've been single for a while now, and like many people in their 30s, I decided to try my luck with online dating. After scrolling through countless profiles on various apps, I finally matched with a woman named Sarah. Her profile showed an attractive blonde with a bright smile, who claimed to be 32 years old. We chatted for a few days, mostly about superficial things like our favorite movies and restaurants. She seemed nice enough, and when she suggested meeting up for dinner, I agreed. I had chosen Giovanni's, a mid-range Italian place downtown that I'd been to a few times before. It wasn't too fancy to be intimidating for a first date, but nice enough to show I'd put some thought into it. I arrived about 10 minutes early and waited outside, scrolling through my phone and occasionally glancing up whenever someone approached. When Sarah finally arrived, I had to do a double take. The woman walking towards me bore only a passing resemblance to the photos I'd seen online. Don't get me wrong, she wasn't completely unrecognizable, but the difference was significant enough to be jarring. Her blonde hair, which had looked naturally sun-kissed in her photos, was clearly from a bottle and showing dark roots. The slim face I'd seen in her profile pictures was fuller in person, and what her carefully angled selfies had hidden was now plainly visible. I tried not to let my disappointment show as I greeted her with a smile and a wave. "Sarah? Hi, I'm Mike." We did the awkward first date half hug, and I caught a whiff of perfume that was just a touch too strong. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," she said, smoothing down her dress. "Traffic was terrible." I nodded, even though I knew the traffic hadn't been particularly bad when I'd driven over. "No problem at all. Shall we head in?" The hostess led us to our table, a cozy booth near the back of the restaurant. As we settled in, I couldn't help but notice Sarah seemed nervous, fidgeting with her napkin and glancing around the room. I tried to put her at ease with some small talk. "So, how was your day?" I asked, picking up the menu. "Oh, busy," she replied vaguely. "Had to drop off the kids at my mom's before coming here." I paused. Kids? This was the first I'd heard of any children. Her profile hadn't mentioned anything about being a mother. "Oh, I didn't realize you had children," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Before she could respond, our waiter appeared to take our drink orders. Sarah quickly ordered a glass of white wine, while I opted for a beer. As the waiter walked away, I could see Sarah debating something in her head. "Yeah, I probably should have mentioned it earlier," she said, fiddling with her silverware. "I have 5 kids." I nearly choked on my water. 5 kids? At 32? I knew from our online chats that she'd never been married, so this raised some questions. I tried to think of a polite way to ask what I wanted to know, but in the end, bluntness won out. "Are they all from the same father?" I asked, immediately regretting how it sounded. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at the table. "No, they're not." Our drinks arrived, providing a brief respite from the awkward conversation. I took a long sip of my beer, trying to process this information. The silence stretched between us until curiosity got the better of me. "With how many men?" I heard myself ask, even as a voice in my head screamed that this was not appropriate first date conversation. Sarah looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. After what felt like an eternity, she mumbled, 3. Wow. The word escaped before I could stop it. And then we just sat there, the silence growing thicker by the second. I could feel a laugh bubbling up in my chest, not because the situation was funny, exactly, but because of the sheer absurdity of it all. Here I was, on a first date with a woman who looked nothing like her photos and had just dropped the bombshell that she had 5 children by 3 different fathers. As I sat there, desperately trying not to laugh, my mind wandered to how we'd gotten to this point. We'd matched on the dating app last Tuesday, and our conversation had been pleasant enough. Sarah had told me she worked in healthcare administration, enjoyed hiking, though her slightly out-of-shape appearance suggested otherwise, and was looking for a serious relationship. Not once had she mentioned being a mother, let alone to 5 children. I thought back to our text conversations over the past week. There had been signs I'd missed, now that I thought about it. She'd been slow to respond sometimes, saying she was busy with family stuff. When I'd suggested meeting up over the weekend, she'd said weekday evenings worked better for her schedule. And when I'd mentioned my recent trip to Disney World, she'd shown an unusual amount of interest in the kid-friendly attractions. The waiter returned to take our food orders, and I realized with a start that I hadn't even looked at the menu. I quickly ordered the first pasta dish I saw, while Sarah carefully selected a salad, asking for several modifications. As the waiter walked away, I knew I had a decision to make. We could sit here for another hour or two, making awkward small talk while eating our meals, both knowing this wasn't going anywhere. Or I could be honest and end things now. I took another sip of my beer for courage. Listen, Sarah, I began, trying to find the kindest way to phrase what I needed to say. I don't see this going anywhere. Her face fell, but she didn't look surprised. I reached for my wallet and pulled out enough cash to cover my drink and the meal I'd ordered but wouldn't eat. As I placed it on the table, I considered saying something about the importance of being upfront about having children on dating profiles, but decided against it. She looked embarrassed enough already. Without another word, I stood up and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Sarah sitting alone at the table. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but shake my head at the absurdity of the situation. I walked to my car, reflecting on how this evening had gone so spectacularly wrong. As I drove home, I found myself wondering about Sarah's life. 5 kids by 3 different fathers, how does that even happen? I tried to piece together a timeline in my head. Assuming she really was 32, and giving her the benefit of the doubt that she'd at least been an adult when she had her first child, that meant she'd had 5 kids in, 14 years. That's an average of 1 kid every 2.8 years, I calculated, then laughed at myself for doing math about this. When I got home, my roommate Jake was sprawled on the couch, playing video games. He paused his game when I walked in, taking in my early return and bemused expression. "That bad, huh?" he asked, reaching for a bag of chips. I collapsed into the armchair. "You have no idea." Jake sat up, clearly sensing a good story. "Come on, spill. What happened?" So I told him everything, the misleading photos, the 5 kids, the 3 fathers. By the time I finished, Jake was laughing so hard he'd spilled chips all over the couch. "Dude," he managed between guffaws, "you can't make this stuff up." "I know," I said, starting to see the humor in it myself. "And the worst part is, I'm still hungry." I walked out before the food arrived. Jake tossed me the bag of chips. "Here, dinner of champions. But seriously, how do you not mention having 5 kids in your dating profile?" I shrugged, munching on a handful of chips. I guess when you're trying to attract matches, mother of 5 by 3 different men isn't the most appealing opener. "Still, that's something you mentioned before meeting up, right? Like, that's first message information, not first date revelation." He had a point. As the evening wore on, Jake and I dissected the date in increasingly ridiculous detail, speculating about Sarah's life and the decisions that had led her to this point. We even came up with theoretical names for her kids and their fathers, creating an entire soap opera-worthy backstory. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Sarah, "I'm sorry about last night. I should have been more upfront about my situation." I stared at the message for a while, debating whether to respond. Part of me felt bad about walking out, but another part still felt deceived. In the end, I settled for a simple, "I appreciate the apology. Good luck with everything." Then I opened the dating app and started scrolling again. This time, I made sure to read the profiles more carefully, looking for any hints of undisclosed children or other potential surprises. A few days later, I was having lunch with my sister Emma, and naturally, the story came up. Emma, being a mother herself, to 2 kids, with the same father, her husband, had a different perspective. "You know, dating as a single mom is really hard," she said, stirring her coffee. "I'm not saying she was right to hide it, but I can understand why she might have been scared to put it out there." "Sure, but 5 kids? By 3 different guys? That's not something you just casually forget to mention," I argued. Emma shrugged. "Maybe she thought if you got to know her first, you'd be more open to the idea. That's not how it works, though. Being a parent is a huge part of who you are. It's not like having a weird hobby or a quirky laugh, it's your whole life." "True," Emma conceded. "But think about it from her perspective. Every time she mentions the kids, guys probably run for the hills. She probably thought this was her best chance at finding someone." I hadn't really considered it from that angle before. Still, it didn't change the fact that Sarah had essentially started our potential relationship with a lie, or at least, a significant omission. The following weekend, I found myself at a bar with some friends, and inevitably, the story came up again. By this point, I'd told it so many times that I had it down to a fine art, hitting all the comedic beats perfectly. "Wait," my friend Chris interrupted, "was her name Sarah Johnson?" I felt my stomach drop. "Yeah, why?" Chris started laughing. "Oh man, I went out with her too. About 6 months ago. Same thing, looked nothing like her pictures and dropped the kid bomb during dinner. Although," he paused, frowning, "she only had 4 kids when I met her." The whole table erupted in laughter. "Are you serious?" I asked, not sure whether to be amused or horrified. "Dead serious. She told me they had 3 different fathers too. Guess she's added to the collection since then." As my friends joked about Sarah's apparently expanding family, I couldn't help but wonder about the reality of her situation. What was her life really like? Did she have support from the fathers? How did she manage day-to-day life with 5 kids? Despite my irritation at her deception, I found myself feeling a twinge of sympathy. A couple of weeks later, I was back on the dating scene. I'd matched with a woman named Rachel, who seemed promising. Her profile explicitly stated she had 2 kids and was divorced, which I appreciated. When we met for coffee, she looked exactly like her photos, and we had a great conversation. As we were leaving, she thanked me for not being weird about her being a mom. "You'd be surprised how many guys act like having kids is some kind of deal breaker," she said. I thought about Sarah and responded, "It's not about having kids. It's about being honest about it." Rachel nodded. "Exactly. It's part of who I am. I wouldn't want to date someone who couldn't accept that." As I drove home from my coffee date with Rachel, I reflected on how different it felt from my dinner disaster with Sarah. Both women were mothers, but their approaches to dating couldn't have been more different. Rachel's honesty was refreshing, and while I wasn't sure if things would work out between us, at least we were starting on the right foot. The Sarah incident became something of a legendary story among my friends. Whenever anyone had a bad date, someone would inevitably say, "Well, at least they didn't have 5 kids they didn't tell you about." It became our benchmark for dating disasters. About a month after my date with Sarah, I was at the grocery store when I saw her. She was in the cereal aisle, surrounded by what I assumed were her children, 5 of them, just as she'd said, ranging from what looked like about 12 years old down to a toddler. They were creating the kind of chaos that only multiple children can create, with the older ones arguing over which cereal to get while the younger ones whined about being tired. Sarah looked exhausted, trying to maintain order while also checking prices and attempting to keep the youngest from climbing out of the shopping cart. As I watched, one of the middle children knocked over a display of crackers, sending boxes scattering across the floor. "Tyler." Sarah's voice carried down the aisle. "What have I told you about being careful in the store?" "Sorry, Mom," the boy mumbled, half-heartedly helping to pick up the mess while his siblings snickered. I quickly turned down another aisle before she could see me, but the image stayed with me. It was one thing to hear about 5 kids, but seeing the reality of it was something else entirely. I found myself wondering about the logistics of her life. How did she manage school schedules, doctor's appointments, extracurricular activities? How did she afford everything on her own? What about the fathers, were they involved at all? As I finished my shopping, I kept catching glimpses of Sarah and her brood. I overheard her negotiating with the older ones about screen time, promising the middle ones they'd go to the park later if they behaved, and comforting the youngest who was having some sort of meltdown over not getting the sugary cereal he wanted. Through it all, she remained remarkably patient, even if she looked like she could use a week's worth of sleep. When I got home that night, I found myself thinking about our date again, but with a different perspective. Yes, she should have been upfront about her situation. Yes, the photo deception was still not okay. But I could better understand her reluctance to lead with, "Hi, I'm Sarah and I have 5 kids by 3 different men." The reality of her life was probably daunting enough without having to face constant judgment from potential dates. That said, I still believed honesty was the best policy in dating. Starting any relationship with deception, whether it's misleading photos or omitting major life details, is never going to lead to success. I decided to update my own dating profile to be more explicit about what I was looking for, including being clear that while I was open to dating someone with children, honesty about it was non-negotiable. A few days later, I was having dinner with my parents when my mom asked about my dating life. I'd told them about the Sarah incident when it happened, and my mom, in her typical fashion, had been both horrified and fascinated by the story. "Have you heard anything more from that woman with all the children?" she asked, passing me the potatoes. "No, Mom," I replied, "but I did see her at the grocery store with all 5 kids." My dad looked up from his plate. 5 kids at her age? How does that even happen? "Now, Robert," my mom chided, "we shouldn't judge. Though I do hope she's done having children. She's got her hands full as it is." I had to smile at my parents' reaction. They'd been married for 35 years and had raised 3 kids, all with each other. The concept of having 5 children with 3 different partners was completely foreign to them. "Well, I hope you're being careful in your dating," my mom added. "We don't need any surprise grandchildren." "Mom," I protested, while my dad chuckled into his wine glass. As the weeks went by, The Sarah story became less frequent in my retellings, though it remained a cautionary tale among my friends about the perils of online dating. I went on more dates, some good, some bad, but none quite as memorable as that night at Giovanni's. One evening, about 3 months after the Sarah incident, I was at a different restaurant on a date with a woman named Jessica. As we were looking over our menus, I heard a familiar voice at the next table. I glanced over and, sure enough, it was Sarah, on what appeared to be another first date. I quickly turned back to my menu, but I couldn't help overhearing parts of their conversation. When her date asked if she had any kids, Sarah paused for a moment before responding, "Yes, I do. I have 5 children, with 3 different fathers. I know that's a lot to take in, but it's important to me to be upfront about it." I smiled to myself, glad to hear she'd learned the same lesson I had about honesty in dating. Her date seemed taken aback but didn't immediately flee the restaurant, which was progress, I supposed. Jessica noticed my distraction and asked what was so interesting. I briefly explained the situation to Jessica, keeping my voice low. She was intrigued but also understanding enough not to turn around and stare. We went back to our own date, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure hearing Sarah being honest with her date from the start. As Jessica and I were leaving the restaurant later that evening, we passed by Sarah's table. She caught my eye and gave a small, slightly embarrassed smile of recognition. I nodded politely in return, and that was that. Looking back now, the whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about dating in the modern age. It's not just about finding someone you're compatible with, but also about being true to who you are and what you bring to the table, whether that's 5 kids, 3 ex-partners, or just a tendency to use too many filters on your profile pictures. As for me, things went well with Jessica. She had no kids, looked exactly like her photos, and was refreshingly honest about everything. But that's another story entirely. The Sarah incident remains a reminder that sometimes the worst dates make the best stories, and that honesty, while not always easy, is always the best policy. And who knows? Maybe somewhere out there, Sarah found someone who was ready to embrace her and her 5 kids. As for me, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts that night at Giovanni's and walked away when I did.